Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host Dr. Reid Robison and I discuss MDMA Assisted Psychotherapy. We review the history of its use, research, mechanisms of action in the brain, possible therapeutic applications in the future, much more. Incidentally, I'm headed out to Colorado next week to be trained by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, on how to do MDMA assisted therapy. I'm really excited for this. MAPS is the organization, as you'll hear about in the episode, that's been doing MDMA assisted therapy clinical trials for PTSD with astounding results. Thank you to all of you for listening to the show. We have some big changes coming to the show soon, so please stay tuned for what we think are going to be some exciting adjustments. If you're feeling generous, please rate the show, leave us reviews, subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the video, share episodes with your friends, all that good stuff. Or don't. We believe in personal agency and autonomy. We'll love you all the same. Please enjoy the episode on MDMA assisted psychotherapy. We are back for another episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast. Just me and Reid. How you doing, Reid?
Just the two of us.
I guess I shouldn't have said it like that. It's just me and Reid. I mean, we're not so bad. You're
yeah,
like us.
I'm doing pretty well, Steve, though. Thanks for asking.
Of course.
I'm 1 year older since we last podcasted.
That's right. You had a birthday.
Yeah. Yep. It's always fun to take a moment and look at how time whizzes by.
Any thoughts about how you might make this year your best year yet?
I think it started when I was approaching 40. I had this big drive inside me to make it the best, and to be in the best physical and mental fitness of my life, and to just be able to do more and more, be more and more nimble, agile. And sure, there are things that come with age, right? As you and I both know, we might be a little more fragile or a little more stiff than we used to be, but I am inspired by, what we can do, what the human body can do with repeated practice and effort is pretty cool. And by taking care of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like my body doesn't maybe respond as quickly to training as it used to, but it's also not too late. And I think there's certain wisdom you gain with age. Not that I'm super old and wise yet, but I'm excited. I'm approaching 40. I'm 39. I'll turn 40 next year, and I'm hopeful that my 40s will be the best decade yet.
Amen. No, the 40s. The 40s are good. I highly recommend it.
Oh, good. So we're actually not talking about Reid and mine's midlife crisis today. Instead, we are talking about what the secret chief, Leo Zeff, called penicillin for the soul, and that is MDMA.
MDMA. There is a little tie-in to my birthday there, or at least I can try to make one.
Yeah.
Because it was in this very month, September, in the year I was born, 1976, when Sasha Shulgin first took MDMA for the first time ever. He had synthesized it in the 60s, reverse engineered it. Merck had invented it, patented it back in 1912. But Shulgin was making this alphabet soup of psychedelics and trying many of them. But what I didn't really realize was that MDMA was one that he reverse engineered, put on the shelf for a decade or more, but then took it one day in September, maybe on the day I was born, who knows. And he called it a special effect. And so then he went to his buddy, Leo Zeff, early 1977, said, "Hey, Leo, you got to try this. It's special stuff. And then that's when they started introducing it to psychotherapy, psychotherapists, couples therapy, individual therapy. And Shulgin published with David Nichols in 1978 the first paper on human MDMA pharmacologic action.
That is kind of a fun tie-in. So you said that Merck had made it back in like 1912. What were their hopes and dreams? Why was it synthesized in the first place?
So they didn't have any hopes and dreams with it. They were making like hematology drugs, like blood thinning or drugs, something like that. And MDMA happened to be just a step along the way of synthesis to another agent. Like they called it, I think, something called methylsafrilamine. And they only patented it just because their patent covered a bunch of these steps. They didn't really even have an intent for it. The history books believed for a while that Merck was making it as an appetite suppressant, but that's been debunked. Like, I think people thought that because MDA, which is another psychedelic type compound in the alphabet soup, MDA was being studied or explored as a potential appetite suppressant, but MDMA was not, even though that might be part of its subjective effect is as a stimulant, reducing appetite somewhat.
Yeah, so we're calling it a psychedelic, and maybe we should talk a little bit about what MDMA is and why a lot of people put it under that broad umbrella of psychedelics, even though it doesn't have some of the same subjective effects that what the so-called traditional psychedelics have, right?
Yeah. Before we go down a mechanism rabbit hole, you want to hear another Shulgin fun fact from the Shulgin dynamic duo. So there's Sasha and Ann, and Ann just passed away within the last several months, right? I think she was 91. But they were, I don't know, these psychedelic pioneers, psychonaut couple extraordinaire, who tripped thousands of times. So what would happen is Sasha Shulgin was a brilliant chemist, and he would synthesize or dream up these things. And I think it was Anne who would take a little tiny bit of it and report back. And they were this like dream team, and she had the psychological and spiritual viewpoints, and Sasha had the scientific perspective. And you can see these trip reports and in their recipe book, like the PCAL TCAL book series by Shulgin. Oh, but the fun fact was this: he was pretty friendly with the DEA. Like, he had a Schedule I license to do this stuff for a long while, and in I think it was around 1980, his friend at the DEA officiated their wedding of him.
No way. That's awesome. Yeah, true pioneers. And I've heard that those books you mentioned, the PCAL and TCAL, they can be sometimes hard to find. Are they not in print anymore?
I don't think they're in print. I have a copy on my shelf over here, but I love the title, like PCAL, A Chemical Love Story. It was like from 1991. It stands for phenylethylamines I have known and loved, and then the other one's about tryptamines. But another thing Anne said was that inventing new psychedelics was like composing new music. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah. Beautiful.
But then in the 90s, after they published those books, a couple years later, the feds raided his lab, fined him $25,000, which was a lot back then, and took away his Schedule I license.
And that was just because of the sort of the propagation of MDMA onto the street, like into illicit use. It goes by their street names, right? Like ecstasy and Molly. Yeah,
it's because it became wildly popular in the 80s as a recreational club drug, and like beyond the therapy circles. And this was on the heels of the big crackdown on psychedelics in general, for like political reasons.
Right. Yeah, and when we talked to the therapists who were working with that medicine all those years ago, it was really tragic to them because they felt like psychedelics generally, but MDMA in particular made them super therapists, like super couples therapists in particular, just because of the effects that we'll talk about here in a minute. But yeah, it's so
Yeah.
exciting that looks like it might be coming back.
Yeah, it's coming back, and there has even been, aside from the phase 3 PTSD research that we talk about a lot and that people hear about a lot in the news, there has been a couples MDMA study done in the modern day in the last few years by a colleague up in Toronto, Ann Wagner, where one of the couple had PTSD, but the other member of the intimate partnership did not, but was given the drug as well to support and heal.
Yeah. Well, should we talk mechanisms? What is this? What is this stimulant that seems to make people love each other?
Yeah, what do they call it? A ring substituted amphetamine. Like it's interesting to think about that, but it is like an amphetamine derivative in a way that I'm still baffled by the fact that Merck and the whole story through Shulgin and so many others and beyond stumbled on this penicillin for the soul, this medicine that dramatically increases feelings of closeness and empathy. And no other drug works this way that I know of, like that, especially that dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it has these, it acts on so many different types of neurotransmitters or receptor sites, right? It's like a triple reuptake inhibitor with, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and then there's some action in there on oxytocin. Like it gives kind of this perfect neurological storm for self-love and love for others.
Yeah, and so to tease that apart a little bit, MDMA works a little differently than the classic psychedelics on serotonin. It's an indirect agonist because it hits a receptor called the serotonin transporter, or SERT, S-E-R-T, and it also stimulates dopamine and norepinephrine receptors, and as you mentioned, stimulates the release of oxytocin, and that's in large part, or in responsible for the pro-social effects and that feeling of safety and empathy. But it's really from that kind of synchronistic combination of those neurotransmitters in this like medicine that was synthesized over 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember hearing Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, talk about why it seems to be such a good PTSD therapy drug, right? He talked about how it sort of downregulates limbic system activity, or the amygdala, so that people are less stuck in fight or flight. They can access memories through a greater connection between the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, I think it was. And so if you had to design something that would help with PTSD therapy, it would be something that does that in the mind, right? Or in the brain in this case. Yeah.
And that's what we call an empathogen, right? And with these pro-social behaviors too, this openness, this self-compassion, this fear reduction, this increase in trust, interpersonal trust, self-trust, and that allows a client in the context of therapy to go deep and access painful, deep-seated emotions that might have been previously inaccessible because they were just too difficult, too overwhelming, too walled off.
Yeah, you call it an empathogen. I've also heard it called an entactogen, where you're having empathy and you're getting in touch with what's deep inside that maybe you have deliberately avoided or subconsciously repressed. And it allows you to be in the presence of this very difficult material with all that kind of self-love we've been talking about, which again, why it's so perfect for PTSD, because a lot of what causes PTSD symptoms to perpetuate is our unwillingness to be in the presence of the emotions that the memories of our trauma bring up, right? Or we have all those different coping mechanisms or parts, however you want to describe it, that have been created to protect us from that content. So everything sort of chills out and relaxes during MDMA assisted therapy.
And the result is this really cool phenomenon that I've heard described in a paper, post-traumatic growth, instead of post-traumatic stress, meaning like then you can start to get post-trauma changes in a positive direction, in self-perception, interpersonal relationships, in how you view life, self, others, almost like changing the course, altering the course of, or the trajectory of what we previously saw PTSD doing to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, therapists love to talk about how, and we do it all the time on this podcast too, but how struggle is an opportunity for growth. And that, we like to say that the emotional triggers we experience are opportunities for growth and development, or friends to follow. Sometimes that's really, really hard to convince people of, because most of us are walking around not really enjoying our most difficult emotions, right? We don't really love being triggered. So while these concepts are true, the only way out is through, and all the slogans, to have a medicine like MDMA that makes that process not only easier, but more complete, right? It's a lot of times what prevents people from growing in response to trauma is the incompleteness of the processing. It gets stuck somewhere along the way. So having something like MDMA that allows you to move all the way through the entire arc of the experience and come out on the other end with the message, with the lesson, is incredible. And the fact that it can do it relatively quickly. I mean, in the MAPS trials for PTSD, we've got, I don't remember exactly how many sessions it is, but it's like, 3 medicine sessions punctuated and surrounded by several regular psychotherapy sessions, like 3 prep sessions, some integration sessions, and then a follow-up. And there are people, we can talk about the stats, but people who have had PTSD for a long time, serious PTSD, you could even call it treatment-resistant PTSD, that has essentially gone away, right? People, what was it, something like close to 90%, like 88% of the participants with severe PTSD no longer met diagnostic criteria at the completion of the study.
It was 67% who didn't meet criteria, but this is of a population of severe PTSD, an average, I think, of 10 years. But there was an 88% metric, and that was around those with clinically meaningful improvement
symptom reduction.
In their PTSD. Yeah. It's striking. It is. It's I don't know, mind-blowing how much that separates from treatment as usual. Mm-hmm. Even in the placebo group, when there is still 40 hours of therapy, instead of that 67% no longer having a PTSD diagnosis, it was 32%. I mean, it still seems high, but that's getting a lot of therapy, right? And that 88% was more like, 60% or so with therapy alone. So it's not like a magic pill, and this is all in the context of therapy, and there's a lot of work involved, but it is striking what MDMA can do for so many people to open up that window of healing, that opportunity to do it when you just couldn't before.
Yeah, I'm glad you underscored that point, that this is MDMA assisted therapy. It's not, if it was just the medicine, then people would be coming out of the club, coming out of raves, spontaneously healed from their PTSD. And I imagine, I don't know, maybe that happens sometimes, but it's MDMA in context with intent and therapeutic guidance and support.
And it's also not ecstasy, like meaning the street drug ecstasy. Ecstasy is a pressed pill of MDMA, people at least think they're getting MDMA in it, plus a bunch of other junk like stimulants. It might have some amphetamines in it, or some cocaine or bath salts or whatever it is. And it also has a high dose of MDMA. Usually it could be upwards of 200, 300, 400 milligrams, way above what these studies use.
Yeah, there's because MDMA is still a Schedule 1 substance. It's illegal that people who obtain it from basement chemists or whatever, their favorite drug dealer, run the risk of getting contaminated stuff. And I think there were some stats out there where there was a sample of MDMA or ecstasy or tablets that had been seized and that were tested, and some of them contained somewhere between 0% MDMA and 50% MDMA or something like that. So we don't encourage any illicit activity or the use of any illegal drugs. The clinical trials we're talking about are FDA approved clinical trials where they use pure MDMA. But you really have to be very careful when you're getting a substance that we've talked about before in the interest of harm reduction, about the wisdom in testing substances that you can't trust the source on. But
yeah, what's that kit? Dance Safe makes one. I think a nonprofit that there are a number of different test kits, but that are easily found.
Bunk Police is another one. Those are the two that I've heard of the most.
And a note on dose, I think, is worthwhile here while we're on the topic, because in the spirit of just openly sharing science and in the spirit of harm reduction, in contrast to those high doses we were talking about in those ecstasy pressed tablets, people in MDMA studies of PTSD, for example, get somewhere between 80 to 120 milligrams as an initial dose, and say another 60 to 80-ish as a booster, optional booster, 90 minutes in, topping out on around 180 milligrams total, given in those two separate doses. And the science says that above 200 milligrams, you just start getting more side effects without the benefits. And there are side effects that come from MDMA, especially dose-related ones.
Yeah, so I mean, the desirable effects are the ones we've been talking about: euphoria, openness, self-forgiveness. There's increased energy, desire to connect, all the things you might wish for in a therapy environment or in an environment where somebody wants to cuddle. But there's also the dark side of what we call side effects, but they're just the undesirable effects, right? There's panic, anxiety, blood pressure increase, heart rate increase, hyperthermia. There's a risk of hyperhydration because of the hyperthermia. People dancing around, sweating a lot, and then drinking a lot, dry mouth, jaw clenching. It can be pretty unpleasant.
Yeah. So to go over those categorically, because MDMA has been studied in over 2,000 participants over the last, say, 20 years. I think it was in the early 2000s that Michael and Annie did the first modern MDMA experiments. And so there's cardiac, meaning it increases your heart rate, blood pressure temporarily. Most don't experience it any more than they would with moderate exercise, right? There's some concerns of neurotoxicity that are from high doses, meaning like if you were to take about 4 times a study dose, your brain's going to stop making as much serotonin for at least a couple weeks. And there was that study. I think it's important to point out there was a study that sounded some alarm bells a number of years ago about potential neurotoxicity with MDMA, but that was retracted because the study was actually like they had kind of messed up their methods and were studying an amphetamine instead, like meth. And so, but it is true that there is a toxic threshold, unlike something like psilocybin, even LSD. There is a neurotoxicity potential if you're getting at a certain really high dose. And there's also a risk of serotonin syndrome at really high doses. We're talking about, like, I don't know, 5 times or more a study dose.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah,
have there been MDMA related deaths because of those super high doses?
Yeah. And dehydration related, etc. Because, like you said, decreased appetite, insomnia, dizziness, jaw tightness, difficulty concentrating. Your gait could even change. Your muscles could be tense, thirsty. And then MDMA, through a different mechanism, regulates water in your system by activating what's called this arginine vasopressin system. So there's a alteration in water regulation and metabolic dehydration that comes along with it. And if you're not paying attention, that can be dangerous.
Mm.
Yeah. There was even one study done maybe 15 years ago that looked back and surveyed heavy recreational users and found heart abnormalities in recreational, like ecstasy tablet users. And those who had heart problems, they had an average of 1,000 doses in their lifetime.
Wow, that's a lot. And as you said, it's not pure MDMA that we would be using in an MDMA therapy session. It's ecstasy, possibly cut with other things.
Yeah, and I've seen some estimates, not recently, but like within the last decade, there have been some estimates of people like in North America using ecstasy, and it's upwards of 1 million people in a given year. Yeah, it's probably more now.
Wow. What about interactions, drug interactions? It's not uncommon for people to combine MDMA with other psychedelics. There's fun terms that are used to describe these combinations, right? Combining it with psilocybin, affectionately referred to as the hippie flip, or with LSD, the candy flip, or ketamine, the kitty flip. And the idea being that MDMA and the other psychedelic have a synergistic effect, that they enhance the effects of one another. And there's questions about timing the drugs because they have different trajectories of experience, right? MDMA is going to have a shorter run through your nervous system, your body, than LSD would, for example.
Yeah, and there are people in the underground who will do those combos too. It's not just recreationally. You see some of that combined, and you can see the rationale of MDMA creating a safe container for another medicine to come in and, say, dissolve ego structures that can be scary.
Mm-hmm.
But when I talk about the why, I need to quickly add on a disclaimer that this has not been studied. Like, first up is studying these things individually,
right.
Which is being done and is very promising. But we could talk about the pharmacology of this and what it interacts with. Like, there are some studies being done with MDMA and SSRIs, for example, and what happens. In fact, when I was in my MAPS training within the last year or two, it was led by Michael and Annie Mitoffer, and Michael had just gotten accepted for publication this paper on MDMA and SSRIs. So he sent me a copy of that just as it was getting prepared for press. And it does talk about how, it's not universal, and these weren't all big sample sizes, but, when you have an SSRI on board, that can interfere with the effect of MDMA. It makes sense because you're giving a serotonin kind of reuptake inhibitor, and MDMA, it could kind of put a little wrench in the cascade of the serotonin effects a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Other drugs. I know that alcohol doesn't necessarily play well with a lot of psychedelics. People talk about, not drinking alcohol because it's metabolized in the liver just like MDMA is, and it could cause a buildup. And
same with caffeine too. Just like it's a concern of combining too many stimulants together, because it's MDMA is already stimulating, but the SSRIs might be more blunting, but there are, like the older antidepressants, the MAOIs, especially, that not many people are on these days, but those become a serious risk of serotonin syndrome, because they are, blocking the reuptake. And so there's certainly a risk of serotonin that I think is a real one at significant doses of MDMA with some of those old ones. So it's worth being extremely cautious with your antidepressants, especially if you're not intimately familiar with the categories of these antidepressants that we're talking about. And then similarly, like if you're on something like Wellbutrin, which is in a class of its own, like a dopamine and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, you could have an increased risk of seizures just because Wellbutrin lowers your seizure threshold. Not that MDMA routinely causes that, but there's a black box warning of Wellbutrin in eating disorders because of a seizure risk even.
What about cannabis? A lot of people use cannabis recreationally and medicinally nowadays.
Yeah. While I could see the rationale of like, I would like to study one day a combination of MDMA and classic psychedelics, right? Like I could see the therapeutic rationale, even though I know we have a lot of work to do on the research front on the path to that. And I can also see the sequencing of those in the right way. But cannabis and MDMA, I don't see any dangerous interactions other than like maybe diminishing your sharp acuity towards these potential risks. But I do see the potential of cannabis just being numbing a little bit to the experience, not universally necessarily, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard for some people they might use it if they become a little too agitated. It's almost use it as a way to deal with some of the undesirable effects. It smooths it out a bit if they've taken too much or if they're sensitive to it. But yeah, then of course, if you're really enjoying yourself and you decide to smoke weed, it could blunt the positive experience for you too.
Yeah, and it might be worth, in the spirit of harm reduction, too, talking about these resources like Roll Safe, Dance Safe, and the science that they draw from to come up with lists of recommended supplements for people who are engaging in these medicines.
Yeah, because, and just to cut you off, and I was going to say not to cut you off, but I deliberately cut you off.
Do it.
It's people sometimes talk about this come down, right? The MDMA come down, or I've heard it tragically referred to as Suicide Tuesday. That people will party over the weekend with these substances, and then by the time Tuesday rolls around, they're so depleted that they're in a rough spot psychologically. And some ideas about why that might be. What I've heard recently, though, is that for most of the people going through the MAPS trials, they don't have these really nasty come down effects like people the people who use the substance illicitly tend to.
Yeah, it's a dose related phenomenon. Like the MAPS protocol does not include the supplementation by default. Some supplements, if you're doing a clinical trial, might be not allowed on a study, like ginkgo biloba, or things that might have even grapefruit juice can interact with some medicines because of its cytochrome P450 action in the liver and all that. But with the MAPS study, there aren't. Some of these may be allowed for participants, and some participants may take some of these. But those resources like Roll Safe, Dance Safe are giving a list of neuroprotective vitamins like ginger, acetyl L-carnitine, vitamin C, magnesium, neuroprotective, neurosupporting, coenzyme Q10, N-acetylcysteine, like a very powerful antioxidant, ECGC from like green tea extract, and then there's often like a melatonin recommendation afterwards. It's basically taking care of mopping up free radicals and oxidative stress that MDMA is known to or theorized to do as doses increase.
Yeah, and I guess one point I was trying to make is that yes, it might be dose dependent, but it's also a set and setting thing. Probably purity of the medicine, but also a set and setting thing. Because a lot of people who are using this substance recreationally or illicitly are up all night. They might be not taking as good a care of themselves physically. So some of these commonly reported come down symptoms from MDMA use could be the result of these other things too, of just not sleeping, dancing all night, not hydrating properly, and becoming dehydrated and sleep deprived.
Yeah, and that jaw tightness, as another example that you mentioned, is dose related with MDMA, and everyone has a different threshold for getting it, and it's not seen by most participants in an MDMA study, but it can show up, and there are things you get, like tips, cues you get in your MAPS training supervision of like, yeah, you might give someone a wet rag to chew on, something like that, if they had jaw tightness or some chewing gum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, speaking of MAPS, I'm going to be heading out to Colorado here in a few weeks to go through MAPS' official MAPS MDMA training. I'm excited. It's going to be under Bruce Poulter and Marcelo Odalora.
Oh, they're amazing. Yeah, I know we talk about Marcella a lot on here because of her Hakomi skills on top of it, and Bruce, her significant other, is an amazing individual as well, and just so gifted at this work. They both are. Like I would want to see them if I were going through a course of MDMA assisted psychotherapy, or Michael and Annie, of course. They're incredible, the most gentle, loving humans.
Yeah, these great MDMA therapy power couples. I'm really excited to learn, and just a cool excuse to go to Colorado. So I'll return and report when I get a chance here on the podcast. I know nice. a lot of the people who listen to our podcasts are aspiring psychedelic assisted therapists, or they're people in the industry, or people just really curious and maybe hopeful patients too. So MAPS is the organization that's pushing MDMA assisted therapy forward. And for most of you who are looking to become MDMA assisted therapists in the future, you'll eventually have some kind of training through MAPS, whether it's through them directly or through a training product that's been sponsored or supported by them.
Yeah, when we were out at the Horizons conference last December in New York, and MAPS gave their kind of State of the Union update and predictions for the future, their moonshot goals. They said that they would like to train 30,000 therapists by 2030 and treat 1 million individuals with PTSD, which I thought was pretty cool.
Ambitious, and I'm all for it.
To conceptualize the experience, the MDMA experience, might be helpful to rattle off this list from a paper that I've pulled from Sumnall. It's an older one, but it gives 6 principal components of the ecstasy experience, is what he called it back then. If you'd like, I can just list them off for you.
Yeah, rattle them off.
So number 1, perceptual alterations, like meaning everything I look at seems to vibrate or pulse when I'm on MDMA. Number 2, entactogenesis, like you said, touching within oneself. On MDMA, I can deliberately generate insights concerning myself, my personality, my relationship with others. Number 3, prosocial, having strong feelings or caring compassion, moving towards other people. Number 4, aesthetic and mood effects. So on MDMA, it's pleasurable to be in one's body and move and dance and feel and touch. Yeah. And number 5, negative intoxication effects. When I'm on MDMA, I find that I have problems remembering things, is kind of what that means. The cognitive changes, distractibility, for example, with all its benefits, like there are some things like, the cardiac stuff we were talking about that happen that may be less desirable. And number 6, sexual effects, just meaning that is different on like the way one views self and others and experiences one's sexuality, I guess. So those are the 6 things from a 2011 paper or 2006 paper.
I guess one detail to add about sexual effects that some people, because it's a stimulant, there might be an increased sort of drive towards sexual contact, but there's sometimes also an interference with one's ability to quote unquote perform sexually. I hate the word perform when it relates to sexuality, but it's the word that came to my mind. So it can cause some erectile dysfunction, or it can cause difficulty achieving orgasm. So things to keep in mind.
Yeah. And here's one more list for you. Ann Shulgin's 4 agreements that she would make when beginning an MDMA session for the participants. They had to consent to these in order to do a session. It was no expression of hostility or aggressive action. 2, no sexual activity. 3, no allowing the consciousness to abandon the body in such a manner that would cause physical death. And 4, no exiting until after the end of the session.
I like those. Very practical. I love the one like no dying. Not allowed to die.
Not allowed. I mean, I agree with that one for sure.
Yeah.
All of them.
Seems very rational. Yeah.
So yeah, she said that one of the problems that most human beings suffer from is suspicion that the core essence of who they are deep down is a monster. There's a terrible fear when you get down to it. MDMA removes that fear. Ann Shulgin.
I was talking to someone the other day about sort of the root, or maybe a root, to much of the suffering in the world being violence toward yourself. It's belief that you are bad in some way, or you are not enough, that you are a monster. And people deal with that self-hatred differently. Some people really turn it on themselves, and there's a lot of self-destruction, and other people will project it outward and become terrible to others, when what they're really trying to destroy is the parts of themselves they see in others. So to the extent that MDMA can help us helpers help others help themselves, then it will be a useful tool.
Yeah. Self-compassion in general, like beyond MDMA, day-to-day self-compassion that you compare with those things that would otherwise keep you stuck. Like you have feelings of regret, guilt. Bring on self-compassion, and you can turn it into growth. If you have that regret, remorse paired with like shame, that's when you're stuck, or worse, right?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I really like the IFS approach, and you've introduced me more to Hakomi, which I'm excited to study. It's one of the reasons I like them is they really provide a good framework for self-compassion, or a good way to conceptualize the things you struggle with in a framework of self-compassion. It's there. You might have a recurring belief that you're really frustrated by, or a pattern of behavior that's really self-defeating. And instead of just beating yourself up about it, you can see it as a part of you, and maybe even a part of you that's trying to save you from something, or protect you from something, or spare you from something. And it's fighting a war that maybe is really over because it thinks you're younger than you are, or less capable than you are. It's just a very gentle way to approach self-improvement.
Yeah. And slightly related to that, and to tie it into our birthday discussion around our midlife crises. You remember also when we were at that Horizons conference, Gul Dolan was giving a talk on psychedelics and what she called metaplasticity, like opening up a critical social learning period. And I was just fascinated how she contrasted it with this oxytocin-mediated synaptic plasticity that MDMA opens up compared to something like cocaine that you could call causing hyperplasticity. So, meaning the opposite, like not only not going to learn new tricks, but you're going to clamp it all down and make it stuck on the, whatever it is, that maladaptive stuff instead. But with MDMA and with other psychedelics, you open up this window where you can learn more. You can relearn and replace old patterns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder, I'm not the neurochemical doctor, but like I wonder the role that oxytocin could play in other psychedelics that don't necessarily activate the release of oxytocin the same way that MDMA does. Like if there was a way to add oxytocin to the mix, if you're going through a challenging LSD experience, is there an oxytocin nasal spray or I don't know, suppository or some way to get it in your body that would help soften things up?
It's interesting. There, you can prescribe compounded oxytocin nasal spray. Like most compounding pharmacies will do it. I've seen people even add that into their ketamine nasal spray prescriptions. I haven't prescribed it that way myself, but I would like to see more studies done about oxytocin. I do follow the oxytocin literature, and there is some. It's mixed. Like it's hard to get an effect out of a nasal spray oxytocin compared to something like MDMA, but there are positive studies that show some things. So I think you're onto something with the idea. But in the way MDMA does it, it's as if you're rewinding your ability to learn to that earlier time in life when we aren't so old and stuck in our ways. Like, you can always learn, but it's like harder to learn a language as you get older. As the brain matures, that learning of a language, as an example, peaks around adolescence, declines over time. But the same thing with our social reward learning pathways around trust and self-compassion and everything else.
Yeah, I love Gouldolin's stuff around these critical periods. It just makes so much sense. Like you'll hear a lot of different phrases used when describing why we think psychedelics are helpful: neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, synaptogenesis. You'll hear the snow globe metaphor, the metaphor of the ski slope, this fresh coat of powder that allows new tracks to be run. But I like the idea of a critical period, because if you study any developmental psychology, there is this concept or this notion of stages of development that occur best within certain critical periods. That they're called critical because if the development doesn't happen in those periods, it's harder for that kind of learning or development to happen. There's sort of it's time limited. So if psychedelics can reopen those windows, that's potential for growth.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing time. And you know what else this is doing? The psychedelic research renaissance is giving us a new view of the human brain and behavior, because like we can see things happen in real time, like from the time zero when you take a medicine to 6 hours later when you've gone through this journey, without all the confounding variables of day-to-day life, like being out there in the world and getting triggered in all the ways that you do. I mean, sure, you get triggered in the therapy room, but it's a controlled setting to do that deep work and to understand more about the deep work we want to help people more and more with.
Right. Reid, any other tidbits about MDMA that you think our listeners would be fascinated to hear?
I would just, I think, and by just recap that, at its heart, the healing relationship is between two people. Whether you're talking about healing in the context of working with your own partner and healing past relationship wounds, or working with a therapist in a therapy room. And when you go into a therapy room with a stranger, or you're in a troubled relationship, when you don't have that open, trusting bond, you're missing one of the ingredients for doing the work, that's safety and trust. And so that's what I think MDMA comes in and does, is helps forge that very bond in a real way. It like helps you do it if you want to do it, and so you can go in there and heal and grow.
Well said. Well said. And, as usual, everybody, we're not doing an exhaustive coverage of a psychedelic medicine, but we assume that if you're listening to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, you're interested in psychedelic therapy. And MDMA is one of the most promising psychedelics that I think is coming down the pipeline, or I guess back into the pipeline, taken out for treatment of really, really tough conditions. So I'm glad we're
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, it's fun chatting with you.
All right, take care. Thank you, dear listener, for listening. It means a lot to me. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. Thanks again. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.